Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to read you an article. We've all wondered why facts are so difficult to communicate and use to persuade people about A, B, C, or D. And I think it was Mike Parenti who said, when was the last time you had a person who was convinced of his position and you said, but considers facts A, B, C, and D, and after your subject considered subjects A, B, C, and D, he said, oh, that's right. I now see the point of your argument, and you are correct. I'm going to have to abandon my point of view and adopt yours. Well, the answer to Mr. Parenti's question is obvious, that virtually never happens. And I found an article, and I read it because I thought it would address the issue that I mention here. The article is by Elizabeth Colbert, Kolbert, and it appeared in the New Yorker. And I read it because I thought it might be illuminating, even though I've come to some very clear conclusions as to why facts are comparatively infrequently important. But I want to read this to you, and I will summarize paragraph by paragraph. And the reason I want to consider it, instead of using it as a point of explaining why facts are so comparatively useless, she demonstrates both her ignorance and the inappropriate use of information. In substance, well, it's not worth, it is worth reading. She describes several experiments that are done using psychology students on the absurd premise that college psychology students are a normal population. They clearly aren't for a multitude of reasons, but nevertheless, they are considered a normal population for the point of certain psychological studies. The first one was, this group of students were presented with pairs of suicide notes. Each pair, one note had been composed by a random individual, the other by a person who had subsequently taken his own life. The students were then asked to distinguish between the genuine notes and the fake notes. Now, the trick was played on the students. Some students discovered that they had a genius for the task. Out of 25 pairs of notes, they correctly identified the real one 24 times. Others discovered that they were hopeless. They identified the real notes in only 10 instances. As is often the case with psychological studies, the whole setup was a put-on. Though half the notes were indeed genuine, they'd been obtained from the LA County Coroner's Office, the scores were fictitious. The students who'd been told they were always right were on an average no more discerning than those who had been told that they were mostly wrong. The second phase of the study, this study establishes the students thinking that they have a talent for discerning the notes, and another group of students figuring that they were totally hopeless in discerning the notes. In the second phase of the study, the deception was revealed. The students were told that the real point of the experiment was to gauge their responses to thinking they were right or wrong. This, it turned out, was also a deception. Finally, the students were asked to estimate how many suicide notes they had actually categorized correctly, and how many they thought an average student would get correct. At this point, something curious happened. The students in the high score group said they thought they had, in fact, done quite well, significantly better than an average student would, even though they had just been told that their earlier experience was meaningless, and they had zero grounds for believing this. Conversely, Those who'd been assigned to the low score group said that they thought they had done significantly worse than the average student, a conclusion that was equally unjustified because they had been fooled in the first part of the exam anyway. The conclusion that the researchers found was that once formed, the students' impressions of their ability to read these notes was perseverant. That is, if they had been told that they were good at reading the notes, they continued in that belief, even though they were told that the reasons for that belief were no longer valid. Likewise, the students who had been told that they were poor at evaluating the notes continued in that belief that they were poor in evaluating the notes, even though they were told that the basis for that conclusion was false. At this point, what the author is establishing, and she's using these psych studies to show that points of view once adopted hang around. Now, she doesn't say why they hang around, but they hang around because they have become part of your worldview. And as part of your worldview, they're part of you. A few years later, a new set of Stanford students were recruited for a related study. The students were handed packets of information about a pair of firefighters, Frank K. and George. I've got to make this. One firefighter's biography had him being brave and courageous and adventurous, and being scored with being a very successful firefighter. That is, his adventurous frame of mind had tended to make him a good firefighter. The other one had been reprimanded a number of times for taking undue risks and for a matter of disciplinary matters. He was not considered a good firefighter, and he was very cautious. The students acquired the idea that an adventurous firefighter was a good risk, and they developed the idea that a cautious firefighter was not a good firefighter because he was not sufficiently aggressive. So they had two different understandings of what constituted a good firefighter. Again, midway through the study, the students were informed that they'd been misled, that the information they'd received was entirely, including the guys that it described, entirely fictitious. The students were then asked to describe their own beliefs as to what constituted a good firefighter or a poor firefighter. What sort of attitude toward risk did they think a successful firefighter would have, and what attitude towards risk would a poor firefighter have? Even after the evidence that they had been told that these stories were fictitious, the attitudes that they had developed about what constituted a dangerous firefighter and what constituted a wise and effective firefighter, those attitudes, even though they were based on a totally fictitious story, the attitudes survived. In this case, the failure of the students to adjust their attitudes with the information that they had been arrived at for fictitious reasons was impressive, since two histories of two firefighters would be insufficient data anyway. But it demonstrated, again, the perseverance of an attitude once the person has established that attitude. And I'm going to point out, though the Stanford study doesn't, is that your attitude is part of your worldview. And as part of your worldview, it is part of you. So if I attack and try to change your attitude. This is not part of the article, this is part of my thinking. If I challenge your attitude, it is a natural assumption for you to believe that I am challenging you. Because I am taking a wedge out of who you are. These Stanford studies became famous. Come on now. And the author of this article says, these studies demonstrate that reasonably seeming people are often totally, she uses the word irrational. Rarely does this insight seem more relevant than it does right now. This is her interpretation of the current historical situation. An essential puzzle remains, how did we come to be this way? She cites another couple articles that demonstrate that the ability to reason is an evolved trait. Like walking on your hind legs, like perceiving color in 3 distinct colors. You have a tricolor vision. That these traits evolved from earlier beings, and that reason evolved as a particular trait. She says, and here we're talking about reason as it involves human beings and society. The reason I'm saying that is she is wrong in saying that reason evolved specifically in a social context. Reason evolved in higher thinking animals precisely because it turns out to be an effective problem-solving tool. If your problem happens to be how to jump this creek, you can do it any of us 17 or 18 ways, but the rational animal will sit down and look at what tools he has at hand and conjure up in his or her mind a variety of ways of doing things and decide in his or her mind what way they want to try. In other words, that is still the reasoning process. If I'm reasoning with Russ about changing his attitude towards 9/11, I'm dealing with another human being. But if I am reasoning about how to get over that damned creek, I'm still using reason in order to manipulate my world. In the case of discussing with Russ, I'm manipulating another human being as part of my world. So to treat reason exclusively as a social tool is stupid. But it is, in addition to these ways of dealing with these various problems, it is a tool for interacting with other human beings. So to that extent, she is correct. And these social scientists say that reason is an adaptation to the hypersocial niche that humans have evolved for themselves. And my commentary here is that it is a problem-solving tool, and it becomes a tool for dealing with our hypersociability when we are being sociable with other human beings. The point we have here is that reason applies even when you're dealing with other individuals or with objects. Or I can treat Russ as an object. The point that the author makes is that if the person in a tribe perceives Russ as not carrying his share of the load, I will argue with him and use arguing tactics to compel him to pick up more of his load. In other words, I'm dealing with a problem. I'm problem solving by arguing with Russ to do more of the work. It is that kind of reasoning that the author is talking about. The reason I'm stressing that is that in that context, I'm using reason as a way of manipulating Russ. But reason can also be used between two human beings. And she doesn't get in. The article is frustrating because she uses reason exclusively as a tool for manipulating people. When Aristotle recognized that if people have an emotional attachment to where they're going, you can't reason with them. Martin Luther recognized this. He said, reason is a whore. Reason will give you the tools to argue the position you want to argue. The only time logic works for you is when your devotion to the truth is stronger than your devotion to winning or not losing. When it's a problem, when it's a tool for solving a problem, it can lead you to truth. When it's a tool for defeating your opponent, it will only be used to defeat your opponent, no matter what your starting ground is. And that's important because when she goes on with the rest of this article, and I do want to cover part of it. She uses, let me go back. She cites confirmation bias. That is the bias of the person I'm trying to show that 9/11 was a false flag. That person, if that person starts out with the idea that 9/11 is as it was told to me, I start out with a bias to confirm my prejudgment. And once a person has that bias, it's terribly, terribly difficult for them to get to change it. So she addresses the issue of confirmation bias. And if a mouse starts out with a confirmation bias that there aren't any cats around, that mouse has a high probability of winding up in a cat's tummy. The point that the author is making is that confirmation bias does not seem to be designed to design as an evolutionary advantage. That mouse is at a profound disadvantage if the mouse believes there are no cats around. And if I were able to show you my set, I would show you how the author is misusing logic. To cite a mouse who has the preconception that there are no cats around is called argumentum ad absurdum. It's taking a logical argument to its absurd extreme, and by showing that the extreme is absurd, the implication is that the whole argumentative fashion is absurd. It ain't so. The author thinks she's providing a logical argument when she's actually glossing over everything that I would like to share with you about using the rules of logic, the rules of dialectic, the careful and precise use of language to get at the kernel of truth that is hiding underneath all of the deception that we get in the newspapers. And RT America, as one example, and another example is the sacred. There are hosts of examples currently in the alternative media that are being attacked by the establishment media because they are tending to tell the truth. RT America has been forced by the Department of Justice to register as an instrument of the government of Russia. What that does is that it tells any person who appears on RT America that the feds are watching you. And you'd better be careful of what you say, because if nothing else, we can go over your income tax returns. It tells anyone who works for RT, tells anyone who accepts an invitation to be a guest on an RT program, it tells all of these people, we are watching you. It's a cold hand of paranoia that is placed on the backs of everyone who may or may not be inclined to participate in RT, either as an employee or as a guest. As an interesting sidelight, Russia has retaliated and is in the process of retaliating and compelling several American news agencies likewise to register as agents of a foreign government, precisely in order to demonstrate to the United States government that two can play at that very same game. Because I set off on that train of thought, I've got to backtrack a little bit. The author uses a third study to demonstrate confirmation bias and how fickle human beings are. And in this study, she reveals both how she and the designers of the study are willing to manipulate the study to show the effects that they want to show. In this study, they take two groups of students, one group that has the opinion that capital punishment is effective and reduces the crime rate, and another group of students who starts out with the point of view that capital punishment is ineffective and ought to be abolished. They show them, both groups, two sets of studies. What the students don't know is that both sets of studies are fictitious, and this two sets of studies are written in such a fashion that their arguments are of equal value. Okay? This group of students who had the opinion that capital punishment was effective came out of that of reading those two sets of studies more convinced than ever that capital punishment was effective. In other words, confirmation bias caused them to give greater weight to that side of the argument and lesser weight to the contrary side of the argument. Those who thought that capital punishment was ineffective chose to give greater weight to the negative argument and tended to ignore. In other words, they used these two sets of arguments to reinforce their own position. Again, the author says that this is confirmation bias, proving that human beings are irrational. What she really proves is that human beings have not been trained to use dialectic thinking in a careful fashion. But she doesn't know that. The interesting thing about that study that I just described is that at the end of the study, they were shown alternative sets of arguments. Now, I've got to go back. On a third group of students, they had comparable arguments, and I need to, for your sake and for mine, I'm going to go back and read some of this. A recent experiment performed by the same investigators demonstrates this asymmetry in how much weight you give an argument. Participants were asked a series of simple reasoning problems. They were then asked to explain their responses and were given a chance to modify them if they identified mistakes. The majority were satisfied with their original choices. Fewer than 15% changed their minds in step 2. On the next step, the participants were shown one of the same problems along with their answer and the answers of another participant who'd come to a different conclusion with their logic. In other words, they were shown a logic problem, they were shown their answer to the logic problem, and another person's answer to the logic problem who arrived at a different conclusion. But they were lied to again, and I want to get back to the implications of lying to psych students. They wanted to know if anyone wanted to change their mind. Well, because they misidentified, the arguments that the students were told were their own were actually somebody else's. And the arguments that were from somebody else were actually their own. Am I communicating? They were given the wrong information as to who was identified with these two different points of view. Now, half of the students discovered they knew their own minds well enough to know that they were being lied to. I said, that's bullcrap. That's not what I said the other thing. So half of them knew their arguments sufficiently well that they were dropped out of the study. Now, the remaining half of them changed their minds when they were told that they had a different point of view, and half of them didn't change their minds. In other words, they did change their minds. Am I making sense? 30% of them, or 25%, I'm misrepresenting them because I want the math to stay simple for the moment. 1/4 of them, when they thought that they had said something earlier that was contrary to their point of view, they changed their point of view. They were very fluid in where they stood. 3/4 of them, or 1/2 of that second group, didn't change their minds. That is to say, it looked as if they did change their minds. Meaning that 25%, actually 30%, but I have intentionally juggled the numbers in order to keep it as simple as possible. 1/4 of them were exceedingly fluid in their point of view. 1/2 of them were very constant in their point of view, and 1/4 of them wavered enough so that they could be considered to be considering changing their point of view. What the author says is that these people were very fluid. And one of the ways she arrives at the point of view of their being very fluid in their reasoning is that half of the second group was willing to change its mind. I would make the assertion that half of the remaining group is 1/4 of the total group. And 3/4 of the total group kept the same opinion, and 1/4 of the group changed its mind. Now the point is still the same. The point is that confirmation bias is strong, and that point is true. But this author is sloppy. The nicest word I can say is sloppy in the way she's presenting data. And she gets sloppier as she goes along, because she uses the fact that confirmation bias causes us to hang on to our points of view by saying the lopsidedness reflects the task that reason evolved to perform, which is to prevent us from getting screwed by the other members of our group. Now that's the social argument that she's making for confirmation bias. I would submit that confirmation bias does serve that purpose, but it also is a reinforcer of the collective experience of the human animal. That is, if I have successfully crossed that creek 3 times with this tool, and I've fallen into the creek once by using this tool, I'm going to try that effective technique before I resort to the ineffective technique. Where she takes this problem of confirmation bias is here. It's no wonder then that today reason often seems to fail us. Now she's looking at the political situation, for example, Donald Trump being elected, and she says that it's due to our inability to reason in a fashion that is effective for our survival. Now, she's absolutely right in saying that we do not reason effectively. But the reasons she uses to back it up are totally wrong. And I am severely criticizing her use of reason in this context because she doesn't use it. She doesn't use any of the tools of reason that Aristotle presented in the Trivium and the Quadrivium that have come down to us through the Middle Ages in the various schools. She doesn't use the tools of reason and the rules of dialectic and logic. She uses what everybody knows. And for the same reason, she says this is the reason that we have people who, contrary to what everybody knows, refuse to get their children vaccinated. This is the reason that, in spite of what everybody knows, they think that guns keep them safer. Now she uses two other as a way of studying the phenomenon of confirmation bias. She uses people who discover something very interesting. And this is the reason I'm really disappointed that I can't make this work. If I ask you how a toilet works, I strongly suspect that you all would give me a fairly accurate description, not of the mechanism, but of the principle. You let water out of the water closet, and as the water goes lower in the water closet, it allows more water to come in so that there's water available for the next time you flush it. In knowing how a toilet flushes, that's the only thing that you need to know. Now, if you wanted to invent a toilet, you would have to be a Rube Goldberg. You would have to look at the mechanism for letting water into the water closet, how to slow the water down as the water got higher in the water closet, and how to turn the water off when the water got high enough. That's a mechanical problem. It is very probable, very possible, and indeed most of us do it all the time, to understand the principle of something without being able to describe step by step the detail of how you accomplish it. Most of us can't do that. That doesn't mean we don't understand how a toilet works. It doesn't mean that we don't understand how a zipper works. It may explain why we don't understand how a lock works, but that's another matter. King Louis XIV was absolutely fascinated with locks because he was fascinated with mechanisms. The Swiss were great mechanics, which is what allowed them to make marvelous clocks. Doesn't mean you don't understand the principle of a clock. It means that you you haven't transferred the principle into the mechanical steps. Big deal. But in doing so, this author undermines her readers' confidence in being able to understand principles. And when she undermines that, what she does is, if you are that unsure of yourself with regard to zippers and toilets and tumbler locks, how more incompetent are you to make a decision about whether teachers' salaries should be based on merit pay? Are you really competent to judge whether we should have a single-payer health system? In all of these cases, the author is undermining the reader's sense of confidence in making those kinds of judgments. Now, at one level, she's correct in undermining that confidence, because the reader hasn't been instructed in how to reason clearly. But that's not because they are stupid. It's because they haven't gotten the correct instruction on how to reason clearly. Neither has she. She is totally benighted in her use of reason, as she's leading her readers to the conclusion that they don't know anything about single-payer health system, or whether teachers should be paid on the basis of merit. I'm going to point out something. Whether we should have a single-payer health system has almost nothing to do with the simplicity or complications of implementing it. It has everything to do with what kind of society you want to be a participant in. Do you want to participate in a society that basically the strong survive and the weak don't? Or do you want to be a part of a society where everyone receives a basic minimum form of social support? That's the fundamental question of single-payer health system. Whether we have teachers that are paid on merit does not have so much to do with the implementation of it, but the kind of teachers that you want. If you have a system where the teachers are paid on the basis of merit, you are defining merit as a certain kind of student performance. That's what merit paid is. When you have a teacher whose salary depends on how the student performs, what are you going to mean by the student performance? 9 times out of 10, that performance is going to be, how does the darn student do on a standardized test? Guess what? The adequacy of a student is not measured by his or her performance on a standardized test. Harvard and all of the better universities know that your performance on a standardized test is totally irrelevant as to how you will be as a manager, or for that matter, as a graduate student in chemistry. My son, bless his heart, said that doctors aren't so smart. And I replied on his Facebook page, doctors have to be really smart. We have to be smart enough to get into med school on standardized tests, and we have to be smart enough to take good care of patients afterward. So it has to be 2 different kinds of smarts. Whereas if you have teachers paid on a merit basis, you're asking them to produce a certain kind of student that is totally irrelevant for that student's future. So in both of these cases, the author is implying that you can judge whether a program should be enacted based on the difficulty of enacting it, when in point of fact the decisive factors are in another area entirely. She pretends to make a logical argument, and the logic is as fallacious as cotton candy. It's a good analogy. Further along, she says that in modern society, what you know overlaps with what you know, and what you know overlaps with Russ and what he knows, to the point that there is no boundary between your knowledge and your knowledge and your knowledge. Now that is true so long as what Janet has is true information. And what you have is information, and what Russ has is information. When what Janet has is disinformation, she will share that disinformation with you, and you will share that disinformation with Russ. Now, when we are sharing disinformation, we are simply reinforcing the general cultural stupidity. She makes this point in this fashion. The same researchers cite a survey conducted in 2014, not long after Russia annexed the Ukrainian territory of Crimea. And here she's reflecting her own bias because she puts the word annexed in quotation marks. She's basically saying they didn't annex it, they invaded it. But we'll let her get away with that for the moment. The question to these students was, how should the United States react to that? I want to point out that she started out earlier in the study, in her essay, accepting logic as a tool. The further along she went in her study, the more she perverted that tool. When she asks the question, how should the United States respond to Russia's annexing of Ukraine, she's making so many inappropriate assumptions, I can't count them all. She's no longer in the hole, she's no longer falling through the rabbit hole. The rabbit hole has opened up and she's falling into some cavity much deeper than that. Now, to her credit, she shares with us that the people were wrong. How can I put that? The people who said that the United States should intervene militarily were also wrong in where Crimea was located geographically. And the more enthusiastic they were about the United States intervening militarily, the more they were also wrong about the geographical location. So her point there is that the participants in this study were progressively wrong both in their geography and in their political analysis. So she's drawing a picture of a relatively stupid human population. And on that point, she's probably correct. It is not so much, however, a question as to whether they were in fact stupid, but why are they stupid? And she's blaming it on the fact that they're hanging on to confirmation bias, that they are hanging on to what everybody knows. Well, ladies and gentlemen, what everybody knows is nonsense. You participants in this class already know that. She doesn't even know that, because she goes on in the article and says, this is why we have people who aren't having their children vaccinated. And she puts Donald Trump in that same category, because Donald Trump and his wife, although they had their children vaccinated, did not maintain the pediatrician's recommended spacing. Well, if she had sat in on this class, she would know that there's a substantial incidence of autism if the children get their MMR before their third birthday. But that's in conflict with what everybody knows. It's not socially acceptable. It's like RT when you tell the emperor that he has no clothes, instead of going and grabbing some shorts, he tells his men to arrest you. Well, you know what? The emperor is naked as a jaybird, and if we don't learn the tools for recognizing falsehood from truth, we're going to be as stupid as that author is. I'm going to close at that point because I've made the basic point that I wanted. The author, and I hope maybe I can print it up for you and hand it out next time. She appears to use reason. She appears to use logic. And she uses it in an upside-down fashion. She uses it to reinforce her already preconceived notion that Donald Trump is a jerk. Now, I might not agree that Donald Trump is a jerk. But if I arrive at that conclusion, I would like to think that I am using logical criteria and valid information. And she doesn't. Thanks for your attention. Don, I think we're going to conclude at that. Are there questions?
When was that article written?
Great question. It appeared in the New Yorker. I'm hoping I have it here.
Probably after the election.
February 27th of this year.
Oh, I threw it away.
No,
I was going to look it up, but
no, February of this year. And it's not, Dawn had asked me a long time ago if we could study logic and dialectic. And the more I learn about the failure of the American educational system, the more I think that we will spend some time on the formal lessons and the formal principles of logic, inductive, deductive, and heuristic, so that you recognize when Walter Cronkite, or whoever is the pretty face today, is leading you down a path that is not justified on the basis of legitimate information and the basis of the rules of dialectic. Dorothy Sayers has an article that I commend to you called The Lost Tools of Learning. It's an excellent article. Unfortunately, it was written in 1947. And the reason I say unfortunately is that Dr. Sayers, I'm sure she's a PhD, Dr. Sayers makes the point that we are turning out students who are totally defenseless against modern techniques of propaganda. And when she says that, she's absolutely correct. But where the fact that it's written in 1947 means that she has missed 70% of the tools of propaganda. She is criticizing seductive and misleading language, but she's totally oblivious to the use of visual images for persuading people. Whereas if you use logic, if I were to use logic, I'm going to look at the wattage of the mattress pad, electric mattress pad that my wife purchased. Because I want to know, does it provide enough without providing too much? Does it provide an adjustable amount of warmth? If I use images, I'm going to be influenced by the pretty young woman in spaghetti strap gown who's smiling at me from the back, from the box. And Dorothy Sayers, because she's writing in 1947, totally ignores the profound impact of visual imagery on misleading the human animal. So we will take up the subject of logic.
When did McLuhan start talking about the medium is the message?
1950s.
Uh-uh.
And Bob Winterholm and I had some interesting discussions and some interesting differences of opinion. And Bob had an intrinsic loyalty to the police departments, and I respect him for that. But it's obvious in our day that some police departments may deserve that respect, but some others clearly do not. And Bob pointed out to me, and rightly so, that with the advance of the message being, the medium being the message, and with the advance of Louis Bernays recognizing that people make decisions on the basis of their emotions, if you can tap into those emotions by getting around their logical sales resistance, you've made the sale. And the social psychologists are 30 years ahead of us in terms of their research of manipulating your mind and mind. Which is one reason I don't watch television at all. I download some programs, especially because Peggy likes some of the detective stories. But I use the analogy, even if you like the taste of Pepsi, if you were told that it had 5 parts per million of arsenic in it, would you drink it? And some people like Pepsi enough that they would. How about if it had 10 parts per million? Would you drink it then? And a few would drop out and a few wouldn't. And I keep upping the number until they discover that they are voluntarily drinking poison, which I choose not to do. No. I'm not saying you can't consume a certain amount of poison and still be healthy. But I have my doubts. Janet.
My frustration always when I get into discussions with people, ever since way back, was, okay, you're trying to follow a logical situation. And then someone does become emotional and it doesn't follow that. Instead of me realizing that's what they're doing, which I think my father always realizes, that he goes back to trying to get them to look more logically. I realize they're doing something emotional, and what I do is I let my emotions react and I negate any kind of logical thinking.
Yeah.
I was thinking, you know, and that's so hard for me because, okay, it goes along, but then as soon as they do that, then it triggers my being, and then I lose the train of thought and I'm just as bad as they are.
Welcome to the human race. And the more you care about people and the more you care about that person, the more frustrating it becomes. One of the advantages that the ruling elite have, and I make this point very seriously, is that they don't care about you. They are perfectly willing. 50,000 children died of starvation in Yemen this last year. You would tend to become emotionally involved and say, God, we got to do something not to let that happen. And I would be inclined to agree with you. The ruling elite say, that's 50,000 mouths that the Yemenis are not responsible for, and therefore we charge them this much more on their loans. There's a great little video that I'll play on some other occasion where a bank manager is sitting opposite a person applying for a loan, and the bank manager says, don't give me that look. This is a bank, not a charity. And you see the person who's applying for a loan is a starving Nigerian child. Now, do you want to live in a society where everyone is supported at a minimum level? Or do you want to live in a society where it's dog eat dog? At my age and with my physical strength, I'd really rather live in a society that's a little bit more humane. And many of the decisions that are made on the basis of logic are made on the basis of what cultural norm are you going to endorse, or what cultural norm are you going to eschew. Since about 80. The cultural norm that the ruling elites have is that we will get ours and let the 99% starve and or feed themselves as best they may.
That sounds like the tax.
The whole business of tax reform is absurd.
Yeah.
Because I'm going to say it this way, and I invite the challenge. Everybody who's analyzing this knows that the tax code is written for the wealthy people. And how they juggle the deck chairs on the
It
Titanic,
doesn't matter.
you
It's all-
know you're going to be screwed.
Yeah.
Excuse my blunt statement. That's the nature of the tax system, and they can put lipstick on the pig, but she's still a pig. And there, all of the ways of deceiving the public, you will spend a whole lot less time listening to the diversions if you recognize that they are diversions. And do your best not to get emotional over it.
Yeah.
Dawn,
Well, I've been thinking about, I think a paraphrasing the first question about how humane a society is.
right.
And my question right now is, can you ask somebody, do you believe that people should only get what they pay for? That's as close to defining that question and answer as I've been able to get. Is there a better way that you think of to say that?
I'm trying to think of this many implications of that. The question implies that for better or for worse, in a society, you only in fact get what you pay for unless the problem is not with the people who don't have enough to pay for it. The problem is always with those who have 1,000 times more than what they need to pay for it. This was the problem in the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention was an argument between the southern halves and the northern halves. The southern have-nots were working in the fields, and the northern have-nots were working in the fields. And they're in the world in which we live. A key question is whether people get what they deserve or whether they get what they have successfully grabbed a hold of, or do they get what they have stolen? And unfortunately, the answer is all three or four. How do you construct a society that equitably distributes resources when the resources initially have not been equitably distributed?
Right, but I guess I'm coming from the angle that if a person says no, any person only deserves what they can pay for, then we've ruled out any discussion about anything else, any of the things that you brought up, like,
Right.
have people deserve what they have? Should they be given something that they haven't actually worked for? Does society benefit by keeping people alive? But as soon as they say, no, nobody should have anything if they can't pay for it, then I think that means that there's no sense in talking to that.
You have defined a society there. You have defined a society, I would agree with you, and you have defined a society in which I do not choose to live. Interesting thing about colonial New England. Any particular town did not have to accept someone coming through and wanting to settle there. If a lesbian came through, it was the town who was in a position to decide, are we going to let you settle here or not? If a tinkerer came through, the town could decide whether they were going to let him settle there or not. And if they said no, he had to go down to the next town. Now, There will be towns that are populated mostly by lesbians. Big deal. Why not? There will be towns that are only occupied or primarily occupied by tinkers. There will be more, quote, I really don't know what this word means, but I will use it. There will be towns that are more liberal. Will be towns that are more conservative. There will be towns that have black, brown, and white. There will be towns that only have black, that only have white, and they will talk to one another. There will be an evolution of those several societies, but that evolution will take place organically from the bottom. What we have in the United States today is the imposition of a culture from above that makes homosexuality, heterosexuality, transvestism, self-identification, sexual or gender models by self-identification, that is saying there is no distinction whatsoever. And that cultural model is being imposed by our media from above. And some of my more verbal friends have said they think that that is a cultural model that is being imposed precisely because it breaks down cultural cohesion. And if you break down cultural cohesion, it makes it a whole lot easier for a small group of elites, whether they are Zionist elites or non-Zionist elites, to control the masses. I'll give you a related, not identical, but related situation. In Libya and in Egypt and in Syria and in Chechnya and in Russia and now, interestingly enough, in the United States, you have specific groups being subsidized and organized and taught in order to undermine cultural cohesion. They were called color revolutions in Libya, Egypt, Chechnya, and Russia. They are called anti-Nazi cohesion in the United States. But they are being used in order to break down the cultural cohesion that arises from above, from below. I have a sense of unity with Tony Godbolt, who is my black colleague in, thank you, in Florida. There is a cultural move to make Tony my enemy because I happen to be white and he's black, to which I say bullshit. You might want to bleep that. But that is a cultural model that's being imposed on us from above, from the people who manage our media, and they have a program, just as they had a program in Libya and in Egypt and in Chechnya and Russia. It didn't work in Chechnya and Russia. It did work in Libya and Egypt, and they're having substantial success in the United States. An additional observation. This applies to Great Britain and to the United States. In the United States today, educators need to be very, very careful in how they say what they say, because they are being brought onto the carpet for using the wrong gender terms, for using the wrong political terms, and God help them if they say something about the Palestinian problem, because the Zionist lobby, the Zionist lobby has been very effective at preventing professors from getting jobs, preventing them from getting tenure, preventing them from speaking at various public convocations. They're very politically active, and they're not your friend. As just one point, let it not be thought that learning logic, learning dialectic is impossible. The Great Debaters is a movie about an imaginative teacher taking a group of underclass kids from a middle city high school, teaching them the techniques of debate, and making them a world-class debating team. And if kids from an underclass high school in the inner city can be turned into logicians who can use the tools of debate, then all of the rest of us can learn the same tools. Now I really am done.